Chu Ge is an online novelist who is currently sitting in front of his computer, typing away rapidly, feeling more and more inspired as if, with each word that appears on the screen, he could see a stunningly beautiful fairy lady pushing open a window to gaze at the moon, lost and lonely, so much so that it felt as if the chill of the open window was seeping in from behind him, sending shivers down his spine. That's not right. His window was in front of him, so why was it cold behind him? Chu Ge turned his head in confusion. A flash of cold light passed, and a gloomy blue long sword was placed against his neck, its bone-chilling coldness seeming to freeze even the soul. Chu Ge stared dumbfounded at the figure behind him, a woman in ancient attire holding the sword to his neck, her phoenix eyes filled with lethal intent. As she stared at his document, the air seemed to freeze for a few seconds, or perhaps just for a moment, and before Chu Ge could react, he heard the woman articulate word by word, "Dare you write that I fall in love with that disciple? I would risk the world collapsing to take your life." Chu Ge was dumbfounded. "Who are you, exactly?" The woman's gaze shifted from the document to the gloomy blue sword tip. Chu Ge. Chu Ge thought he was hallucinating. The female protagonist ran out of the book, and she put a sword on the author's neck, threatening not to write her falling in love with the male protagonist. Could it be that too much writing led to mental issues, starting to develop hysteria? But looking at the door, it was properly closed, and there was no sound of the door opening or closing just now. She just appeared behind him so abruptly. How did she come in? To say a thief sneaked in would be even more far-fetched. What kind of thief would break in to tell him to change his book? Saying a hacker lord saw your writing was too trashy and hacked your computer to help you write would be slightly more logical. And this woman was too beautiful. Chu Ge had thought that Gu Ruin was the most beautiful woman he had seen in reality, but it hadn't been a few hours before this belief was shattered by the woman before him. It wasn't just her appearance. Her temperament was hard to describe. Despite her fierce and angry eyes, there was something incredibly ethereal and dreamy about her, making it seem as if she could ascend and merge with the clouds and mist at any moment. Is this a temperament and image a modern person could possess? From appearance to temperament and even attire, everything matched the description in the book to a T. Where could one find such a woman to cosplay with you? Really ran out from the book. But he wasn't some immortal being. How could he turn the world in the book into reality? Being a writer accustomed to roaming through various imaginations, Chu Ge, despite being slightly overwhelmed, managed to say somewhat difficulty, "Let's talk this over. Can you put down the sword first?" Xiao Wui stared at his neck, her expression flickering uncertainly. But the sword suddenly vanished into thin air. "Killing you doesn't require a sword, Chu Ge, not to mention without a sword. If you are really Xiao Wui, that's a big shot capable of ascension. Your presence alone could kill me." But the pressure from this person wasn't as exaggerated. Or is it just because she doesn't want to kill? Stand up, like picking up a chicken. Xiao Wui lifted Chu Ge from the chair and sat down herself. Then, she was stuck. Chu Ge, with his hands in his pockets, stood aside, watching those perfect jade fingers hover over the keyboard, unsure of how to type out her thoughts. "Do you want to write it yourself?" Chu Ge couldn't help but ask. If it was really Xiao Wui, it would be quite amusing for the female protagonist to write about herself. Chu Ge was curious about what kind of development it would be. "Pen to you. You write." Xiao Wui was silent for a moment, her fingers lightly touching the keyboard. Zzz. A strange electric current noise came from the USB port. Xiao Wui frowned and withdrew her hand. "Chu Ge, don't tell me you're trying to inject spiritual power to analyze this magical tool." Xiao Wui. Chu Ge really believed she was Xiao Wui at this moment. Could a normal person perform such feats? After an awkward silence, Xiao Wui finally spoke. "How is this magical tool used? Why can't I feel the flow of spiritual energy? The electric energy here seems unrelated to your text. How do you input the words into this crystal screen?" Chu Ge twitched his cheek. "I can't explain this to you. I'm just a humanities student." He thought for a moment and cautiously said, "What do you want to write? You tell me, and I'll write." He also wanted to test what the situation was. If according to the female protagonist, herself to weave her future, what changes would there be? Xiao Wui turned to look at Chu Ge, somewhat surprised. You were confused and panicked before, but now you're calm so quickly. Chu Ge smiled. Anyone with a sword against their neck would panic. I'm not like those cultivators who have walked through mountains of corpses and seas of blood. If you really are Chiu Wui. Chiu Wui asked, why aren't you panicking now? Because panicking is useless. Now I'm more curious about what's going on than you are. Chu Ge touched the keyboard to make sure it still worked. Tell me, how do you want me to write? Chiu Wui looked at him again. Without hesitation, write that I have an epiphany and ascend, breaking the limit between heaven and man. I think that's ineffective because it goes against the fundamental setting of the world. Like if I write immortal suddenly ascending, it certainly won't hold true. Chiu Wui understood Chu Ge's meaning, her eyes slightly narrowing. In your setting, I cannot ascend. Feeling the hidden anger and killing intent in Chiu Wui, Chu Ge hurriedly explained, it's not that you can't ascend suddenly now. There's a lot of plot about you in this world, involving a lot of interactions with other characters. If the female protagonist is gone suddenly, the whole story framework would collapse. It's to say, the foundation of the novel world is built on character construction. First Chu changed Chiu Wui, then there's this world. Chiu Wui was silent for a moment, then stepped aside, insisting, right as I said. Chu Ge shook his head, and sat down to type. As Chiu Wui's mood broadened, she suddenly felt the gates of heaven open, and the intention to ascend spread gradually. The sky filled with tribulation clouds, a great heavenly tribulation. Chiu Wui silently felt for a while, and shook her head slightly. It's useless. Chu Ge sighed and smiled. I knew it wouldn't work. It definitely has to be logically consistent within the framework of the world. Chiu Wui looked up and thought for a while, sighing softly to herself. I didn't expect that our Creator God is just a powerless scholar. Our world's truth, just a book. All joys, angers, sorrows, and pleasures are manipulated by someone. Our future fate is just a predetermined trajectory. Even my emotions, changing with the stroke of a pen. Chiu Wui's tone was somewhat melancholic, also somewhat enlightened, difficult to fully articulate. Chu Ge stared at her expression, thinking if she really was from the book, then this realization of the truth would indeed be painful. Right, it could drive one mad from collapsing worldviews. Of course, if it was the Chiu Wui he wrote, she wouldn't collapse. With her strong will, she would seek to take control of her own destiny. That's right, isn't she doing just that? She was extremely alert, and repulsive to the thought of suddenly having feelings for a disciple, thus unknowingly triggering some potential and breaking through the boundary. Most likely so. Confirming this, the fear of having a sword against his neck slowly faded, replaced by a kind of closeness and slight sympathy. How to describe this feeling? This is a character created by himself, like a daughter. For him, this is just a story, at best embodying literary ideals, at worst purely a tool for making money. But for her, it's her entire life being arranged by someone else. Chiu Wui frowned at him, suddenly asking, are you sympathizing with me? Chu Ge pursed his lips, not answering, instead saying, you said it's all manipulated by someone, but it's not entirely true. Just like I can't just write you ascending directly because it needs to be a logically consistent action. For a character, every action must fit what that character would do, what that character would say. At most it's choosing one of several possible options. It's also one of the choices you yourself would make, not something that goes against your character. He paused, then laughed. Some say once a character is written, they're out of the author's control. Your appearance is the strongest proof of that statement. Chiu Wui quietly looked at him, her eyes deep and serene, her thoughts inscrutable. After a long while, she coldly said, are you suggesting that me possibly liking that man is my own choice? Chu Ge turned pale. That could never be her choice. Chiu Wui, with her lofty view of the world, how could she? Even if she were to have mundane thoughts as deliberately laid out by him, the object of those thoughts couldn't possibly be a newly accepted disciple. The gap was too large. But this is a harem novel. Conditions must be created if they don't exist. Getting the unattainable woman is the thrill of a harem novel. Otherwise, who would read it? But that indeed was an unattainable woman, meaning it truly wasn't a choice Chiu Wui would make. It was the author's manipulation, to the point she was repulsed enough to run out from the book. Right. Chiu Wui coldly said, that definitely cannot be a choice I would make. Which means you can at least to some extent affect the so-called consistency. According to the storyteller's terms, even if there are mistakes, they can be rounded out. Chu Ge really regretted making her so intelligent, only managing to wipe his sweat and say, "Indeed, it can be slightly rounded out." Chiao Wuyi was about to say something when her expression suddenly changed slightly. Chu Ge watched as her figure began to blur, turning from a solid form into a transparent ghost, then becoming fainter and fainter, like a shadow, until she disappeared. Her last words echoed in the air, "Whatever method you use, do not continue to write any emotional entanglement between me and that Chu Tange. I will come out anytime. And if you continue to write nonsense, then you'll never need to write again." Her voice faded away, and she was gone. Chu Ge looked at the empty room, truly feeling as if he had been dreaming.